Story 1. The Backwards Highway. Marcus Chen had been hauling refrigerated goods across the Midwest for 17 years, and in all that time, he'd never once gotten truly lost. He prided himself on knowing the interstates like the back of his hand, understanding every truck stop, every way station, every shortcut that could shave 30 minutes off a delivery. That confidence made what happened on Interstate 80 through Nebraska all the more terrifying. It was November 14th, 2019, around 2 in the morning. Marcus was pushing through to make a morning delivery in Omaha, his rig loaded with frozen vegetables bound for a distribution center. The highway was empty, which wasn't unusual for that hour. What struck him as odd was how empty it was. In 17 years, he'd never driven more than 20 minutes on I-80 without seeing at least one other vehicle. Yet here he was, 40 minutes in, completely alone. The radio had gone to static 30 miles back, which he'd attributed to being between stations. But when he tried to find any station, anything at all, there was nothing but that empty hiss. His CB radio was equally dead. He picked up the mic and called out, "Breaker, breaker, this is Frozen Phoenix, anybody out there?" Nothing. Not even the usual chatter from other drivers or the static pop of distant conversations. That's when he noticed the mile markers. He just passed mile marker 387, heading east toward Omaha. 5 minutes later, he passed mile marker 391, then 395. The numbers were climbing like they should, but something felt wrong. The geography didn't match. He'd driven this route hundreds of times. There should have been an overpass near mile marker 393, but he hadn't seen it. The exit for a small town called Pleasant Dale should have appeared, but the highway stretched on, featureless and dark. Marcus checked his GPS. The screen showed his blue dot moving along I-80, right where he should be. But the estimated arrival time was wrong. It had been showing 1 hour and 40 minutes for the past half hour of driving. He was moving. The speedometer confirmed he was doing 70 miles per hour, but the GPS claimed he was making no progress. He decided to take the next exit, maybe find a truck stop, get his bearings, perhaps call his dispatcher. But the next exit never came. Mile marker 399 passed, then 403, then 407. The exits that should have been there simply weren't. The highway continued, a perfectly straight line of asphalt cutting through darkness that seemed deeper than any night should be. That's when he saw the other truck. It was ahead of him, maybe a quarter mile, its taillights glowing red in the distance. Relief flooded through Marcus. He accelerated, eager to catch up, to flag down another driver and confirm he wasn't losing his mind. As he drew closer, he could make out details. It was a Peterbilt, similar to his own, pulling what looked like a refrigerated trailer. He got close enough to read the license plate. His blood went cold. The plate was from California, just like his. The number was familiar. Very familiar. He'd seen it every time he'd walked around his rig during pre-trip inspections. It was his license plate. Marcus slammed on the brakes, but his rig didn't slow. The pedal went to the floor with no resistance, and his speed remained constant at 70 miles per hour. He tried the engine brake. Nothing. The truck ahead maintained its distance, always a quarter mile in front, its taillights identical to his own. He grabbed the CB mic again, his hand shaking. "This is Marcus Chen. I don't know what's happening, but if anyone can hear me, I'm on I-80 eastbound and something's very wrong." As he spoke, he heard his own voice coming through the CB speaker, but it was delayed, arriving a few seconds after the words left his mouth. And there was something else underneath his voice, a whisper he couldn't quite make out. The mile markers were accelerating now. 411, 415, 420, 427, each one appearing faster than the last. The truck ahead of him was getting closer despite him not accelerating. Or was he getting closer to it? He couldn't tell anymore. The distance between them seemed fixed and shrinking simultaneously. Marcus noticed something else. The landscape outside his windows was changing. not gradually, but in jumps. One moment there were fields, then suddenly there were hills, then back to flatland, then a forest that shouldn't exist anywhere on this stretch of highway. And with each change, the darkness seemed to press closer to the road, as if the world beyond his headlights was simply ceasing to exist. The truck ahead was close now, maybe 50 feet. He could see the trailer more clearly. It was identical to his. Same company logo, same refrigeration unit mounted on the front. As he pulled alongside it, he tried to look into the cab, but the windows were dark, reflecting his own truck's lights back at him. Then he was passing it. His speedometer still read 70, but he was overtaking the other truck. As his cab drew even with the other driver's side, he turned to look. The window was down. The driver turned to look at him at the exact same moment. Marcus was staring at himself. Not a similar-looking person. Not a twin. Himself. Same scar on his cheek from a childhood accident. Same blue jacket he was wearing right now. Same expression of absolute terror. The other Marcus's mouth opened, screaming something Marcus couldn't hear over the sound of the engines. He stomped on the accelerator, desperate to get past this impossible thing. His truck surged forward, finally responding to his input. He pulled ahead, watching in his side mirror as his doppelganger and the duplicate truck fell behind. But then in the distance ahead, he saw taillights. Another truck, same make and model, same distance ahead as the first one had been. The mile markers were meaningless now, the numbers climbing into the thousands. 2,447, 5,891, 12,003. The landscape outside had stopped changing. There was nothing but perfect darkness beyond the reach of his headlights, as if the universe consisted of only this stretch of highway and his truck. He lost track of how many times he passed himself. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Each time the other Marcus looked more desperate, more terrified. Some were crying, some were screaming, some just stared with dead, hollow eyes. And each time Marcus felt a little more of himself drain away, as if each encounter was taking something essential from him. Then, without warning, everything snapped back. There was a physical sensation of falling, though his truck remained on the highway. The darkness lifted like a curtain being pulled away. His radio crackled to life with a country station. The CB came alive with chatter. His GPS showed a normal arrival time. He looked at the mile marker passing by, 388. He'd somehow gone backward or never moved forward at all. He checked the clock on his dash. 2:07 a.m. 7 minutes had passed since he'd first noticed something was wrong. Only 7 minutes for what had felt like hours. Marcus pulled off at the next exit, which appeared exactly where it should have been. He parked at a truck stop, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. Other trucks surrounded him, their drivers sleeping peacefully in their cabs. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. But when he looked in his side mirror, checking the highway he'd just left, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Far in the distance, barely visible, was a truck pulling onto I-80. It looked exactly like his. And behind it, spaced at regular intervals, were more trucks, all identical, all heading east. A convoy of himself stretching back into the darkness. Marcus never drove I-80 through Nebraska again. He took early retirement 6 months later at 42 years old, unable to shake the feeling that somewhere on a highway that exists alongside our own, versions of himself are still driving, still passing themselves, still trapped in that endless loop. Sometimes, late at night, he'll turn on a CB radio and scan through the channels. And sometimes, just sometimes, he hears his own voice calling out for help, the signal weak and distorted, coming from somewhere very far away. Story 2. The Breathing Cargo. Denise Walker had been a long-haul trucker for 12 years, and in that time she transported just about everything imaginable. Furniture, electronics, industrial equipment, livestock, even once a disassembled carousel for a traveling carnival. She learned not to ask too many questions about cargo as long as the paperwork was legitimate and the weight was within legal limits. That philosophy served her well until the night she picked up a sealed container in Spokane, Washington. The job came through a broker she'd worked with before, a reliable source for high-paying runs that didn't ask about her schedule or personal life. The rate was exceptionally good, $12,000 for a single container delivery from Spokane to a private address in rural Montana. The only unusual stipulation was that the container had to remain sealed, and she was to drive straight through without stopping except for fuel. Denise arrived at the warehouse district on September 23, 2021, just after sunset. The loading area was deserted except for a single shipping container sitting under a sodium light, its corrugated metal sides painted a dark blue that looked almost black. Two men in unmarked coveralls finished securing it to her flatbed trailer, working in complete silence despite her attempts at friendly conversation. "What am I hauling?" she asked the older of the two men as he climbed down from checking the tie-downs. "Agricultural equipment," he replied, not meeting her eyes. "Specialized stuff. Sensitive to temperature fluctuations, so don't stop for long, go straight through." The paperwork listed the contents as mechanical agricultural components, which was vague but not unusual. She signed the delivery manifest and pulled out of the lot, heading east toward Montana on Interstate 90. The container rode smoothly, well-balanced and properly secured. Everything seemed normal for the first hour. Then she heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the engine noise and road sounds. A rhythmic thumping, regular as a heartbeat, coming from behind her. She checked her mirrors, thinking something might have come loose, but the tie-downs were secure, the container wasn't shifting. Yet the thumping continued, growing gradually louder. Denise turned down the radio, listening carefully. The sound was definitely coming from the container. Thump, thump, thump. Steady and consistent, about once every second. It reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite place it. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe some kind of machinery inside had turned on, some automated system. Agricultural equipment could have compressors or cooling systems that kicked on automatically. She was approaching the Idaho border when the thumping changed. It was faster now, more insistent. And there was something else beneath it, a sound like air moving through a confined space. Like breathing. Deep, slow breathing from something very large. "It's just mechanical," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. "Compressor cycling, air brakes on the equipment, something like that." But the breathing continued, and now she could feel it. The entire rig would shudder slightly with each exhalation, as if whatever was in the container was large enough that its breathing affected the truck's weight distribution. She checked her mirrors again. The container looked the same, dark blue metal reflecting the occasional passing headlight, but she could swear it was moving. Not rocking or shifting, but expanding and contracting like a massive lung. Her CB radio crackled. "Flatbed hauling the blue container, this is Big Red, you got your ears on." Denise grabbed the mic, grateful for any distraction. "Yeah, this is Flatbed, go ahead. You want to pull over and let me pass, you're weaving a bit there, making me nervous." She glanced at her speedometer. She was doing exactly 65, perfectly centered in her lane. "I'm not weaving, friend, straight as an arrow." "If you say so," the voice replied, skeptical. "But from back here, looks like you're drifting left and right. Might want to check your load." The radio went silent. Denise looked in her passenger side mirror and saw the truck that had been behind her accelerating past. As it drew alongside, she could see the driver's face. He was staring at her cargo with an expression of pure horror, his mouth open, eyes wide. He accelerated hard, his truck roaring past and disappearing into the darkness ahead as if fleeing from something. The breathing was louder now, impossible to ignore. And there was a new sound, a wet sliding noise like something large and slick moving against metal. Denise's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at her to pull over, to unhitch the container and leave it on the side of the road. But the contract had been specific, and she'd been paid half up front. $6,000 she'd already spent on truck repairs and bills. She needed the other $6,000. She was deep into Montana, on a stretch of highway with nothing but forest on either side when the smell started. It seeped into the cab despite her windows being closed, a thick, organic odor like rotting vegetation mixed with something animal. It was so strong she gagged, her eyes watering. She cranked up the air conditioning, switched it to recirculate, but the smell only grew stronger. The container was definitely moving now. She could see it in her mirrors, the metal sides bulging outward and then contracting over and over in sync with that horrible breathing. Whatever was inside was big, filling the entire container, pressing against the walls with each breath. Her phone rang, making her jump. The caller ID showed the broker's number. She answered, her voice shaking. "Yeah, Ms. Walker, this is extremely important. Do not, under any circumstances, stop driving. Do not open the container. Do not look inside. Just deliver it to the address provided." "What the hell am I carrying?" she demanded. "This isn't agricultural equipment. You're carrying exactly what the manifest says, but it's imperative that you maintain constant motion. The contents become unstable when stationary. Just keep driving." "It's breathing. The goddamn thing is breathing." There was a long pause. "Yes, it does that. It's normal, just part of the preservation system." "Keep moving, Ms. Walker. You're almost there." The line went dead. Denise tried to call back, but her phone had no signal despite having full bars a moment before. She was completely alone with whatever was in that container. The next hour was the longest of her life. The breathing grew so loud it drowned out the engine noise. The container bulged and contracted so violently she expected the tie-downs to snap. The smell became unbearable, making her dizzy and nauseous. And worst of all, she began to hear other sounds from inside. Scraping, scratching, and what might have been a voice, low and distorted, forming words she couldn't quite understand, but that filled her with primal terror. The GPS directed her off the highway onto increasingly smaller roads, deep into the Montana wilderness. No houses, no lights, nothing but endless trees. Finally, she turned onto a gravel road that led to a clearing where several buildings sat, all dark except for one with a single light above its entrance. Men were waiting, dozens of them, all wearing the same unmarked coveralls. They directed her where to park, then swarmed the container, unhitching it with practiced efficiency. The breathing had stopped. The container was still and silent, just a normal blue shipping container. A woman approached, counting out $6,000 in cash. "Thank you for your discretion, Ms. Walker. The contract is complete." "What was I carrying?" Denise asked. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Agricultural equipment, exactly as stated. You should leave now. This facility is private property." As Denise drove away, empty trailer rattling behind her, she looked back. The men were opening the container. She saw something emerge, something that made no sense, that her mind couldn't quite process. It was massive, wet, and moved in ways that violated every law of physics she understood. Then she rounded a curve and the facility disappeared from view. She received a message the next day. Her phone pinged with a photo attachment from an unknown number. It showed her rig empty, parked in that clearing. But in the photo, there was something in her cab. Something large and dark, pressed against the driver's side window, as if it had been sitting in her seat, looking out at the facility. Denise still drives, but she refuses any cargo that comes sealed. She checks every load personally, inventories every item, won't haul anything she can't identify. And she's installed a camera in her cab that records constantly, uploading footage to cloud storage. Because sometimes, late at night, she hears that breathing again, coming from the sleeper berth behind her seat, and she needs proof that there's nothing there. The camera never shows anything, but the audio picks up that steady, massive respiration, and sometimes underneath it, that distorted voice forming words she's learned not to try to understand. Story 3. The Phantom Fuel Stop. Raymond Ortiz had been driving trucks for 23 years, mostly running routes between Texas and California along Interstate 10. He knew every fuel stop, every rest area, every good place to grab a meal from El Paso to Los Angeles. His routine was meticulous, developed over 2 decades of experience. He'd fuel up in Van Horn, Texas, make good time through New Mexico, grab dinner in Tucson, and push through to Phoenix before sleeping. He'd made this run at least 300 times. That's why it was impossible that he'd never seen the fuel stop before. It was June 3, 2020, the middle of the pandemic, which meant the highways were emptier than usual. Raymond was hauling furniture, a full load bound for a warehouse in Ontario, California. He'd left El Paso at noon, and by 8 p.m. he was approaching the stretch of I-10 between Lordsburg and Tucson, a desolate section where civilization was scarce and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. His fuel gauge was reading a quarter tank, which was fine. He had enough to make Tucson easily, where he'd fill up at his usual stop, but something made him uneasy. The highway felt wrong. The mile markers seemed off, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. The sun had set, and the darkness that settled over the desert was absolute, the kind of dark that existed before electricity, when humans feared the night for good reason. That's when he saw the signs. First one, then another, bright green reflective markers announcing a travel plaza ahead. Food, fuel, lodging next exit. But Raymond knew this stretch of highway. There was no travel plaza here. The next services were 40 miles ahead in a small town called Wilcox. He almost drove past the exit, but his fuel gauge had dropped to under 1/8 of a tank. That was wrong too. He should have had more fuel than that. Uneasy, he took the exit, the off-ramp curving down into darkness, his headlights the only illumination in a world of absolute black. The travel plaza appeared suddenly, almost materializing out of the darkness. It was enormous, bigger than any truck stop Raymond had ever seen. 3 islands of fuel pumps, each with 8 positions. A massive main building blazing with fluorescent light. A parking lot that could accommodate 100 trucks, currently about half full. Everything was modern, clean, perfect, and completely impossible. Raymond pulled up to a fuel island, shut down his engine, and climbed out. The night was utterly silent. No engine sounds from the other trucks. No music or conversation from other drivers. No insect noises despite being in the middle of the desert. Just silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The fuel pump was standard, modern, accepting credit cards. He swiped his card and began fueling. That's when he started noticing the details that were wrong. The other trucks in the lot were all older models, nothing from the last 10 years. But they were pristine, perfectly maintained, looking simultaneously vintage and brand new. And none of them showed any signs of recent travel. No road dust, no bug splatter on the windshields, nothing. The pump clicked off at 42 gallons. Raymond's tank only held 40. He looked at the numbers on the pump display. They were clear, unambiguous. 42 gallons. He depumped more diesel than his tank could hold, but there was no overflow, no fuel on the ground. He walked toward the main building, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Through the large windows, he could see other people inside. Truckers sitting in booths, eating. Staff behind a counter, but something about them was off. They were all moving in perfect synchronization, raising forks at the exact same moment, turning heads at the same angle as if choreographed. The automatic doors slid open as he approached. The interior was spotless, gleaming with rows of food, supplies, everything a trucker could need. But the merchandise was wrong. The brand names were almost right, but not quite. Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. Fritas instead of Fritos. Small differences that created a profound sense of wrongness. A woman stood behind the counter, smiling at him. She was wearing a uniform for a truck stop chain Raymond recognized, but the logo was backward, mirror reversed. "Welcome," she said. Her voice was pleasant but had an odd quality, like it was being played through a speaker, reproduced rather than created. "Where exactly am I?" Raymond asked. "Mile marker 348, Interstate 10, New Mexico," she replied. "How can I help you today?" "This place wasn't here before. I've driven this route hundreds of times." Her smile never wavered. "We've always been here. Perhaps you just never needed to stop before." Raymond looked at the other customers. They were still eating, still moving in that synchronized way, but now they were all facing him, all of them, watching with identical expressions of placid contentment. "I need to use the restroom," he said, looking for any excuse to move to break the wrongness of the situation. "Of course, down the hall to your left." He walked past the synchronized diners, feeling their eyes tracking him. The hallway was long, longer than the building should have allowed. The restroom door had a sign showing a simple stick figure, but the figure was facing backward, walking away from the viewer. Inside, the restroom was perfectly normal. Too normal, clinical, sterile. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw his own face staring back, but something was wrong with it. The reflection seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after he did, like watching himself on a video call with lag. He splashed water on his face, and when he looked up, there were other faces in the mirror behind him. The synchronized diners standing in the restroom doorway, all wearing that same placid smile. He spun around. The doorway was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, the faces were gone. Raymond left the restroom quickly, walking fast back toward the main area. The diners were back in their seats, eating again in perfect unison. He headed for the exit without stopping at the counter. The woman called after him, "Have a safe journey. We'll see you again." He practically ran to his truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. It turned over immediately, and he pulled out of the fuel island, heading for the exit back to the highway. In his mirrors, he could see the travel plaza, still blazing with light, and all the people inside had stopped eating and were standing, facing his direction, watching him leave. The entrance ramp back to I-10 was longer than it should be, curving through darkness for what felt like miles. When he finally merged back onto the highway, he checked his odometer and time. He'd been at the fuel stop for 15 minutes, but according to his truck's clock, 3 hours had passed. It was 11 p.m., not 9. He drove straight to Tucson without stopping, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. When he arrived at his normal fuel stop, he got out and checked his tank. It read just over 3/4 full. He'd lost almost no fuel covering the 70 miles from where the Phantom stop had been. Raymond filed a report with the Highway Patrol the next day, describing the location and exit number. They told him there was no travel plaza at that mile marker, no exit. Interstate 10 was straight and uninterrupted for 80 miles in that section. When he checked his credit card statement, there was no charge for the fuel he'd supposedly pumped. But in his logbook, in his own handwriting, was an entry he didn't remember writing. Fuel stop, mile marker 348, 42 gallons. Elevation, 127 feet. He checked topographic maps later. There was no place along I-10 in that area with a negative elevation. Sea level and above only. Raymond still makes the Texas-California run, but he refuses to drive that section at night anymore. He schedules his trips to pass through during daylight hours, always with a full tank. Because twice since that night, he's seen the exit signs for the Phantom fuel stop, bright green reflective markers announcing services that don't exist. Both times he's driven past, resisting the urge to take the exit, fighting the strange compulsion that whispers he should stop, that he's expected, that they're waiting for him. And once pulled over at a real rest area to sleep, he woke at 3 a.m. to find a business card tucked under his windshield wiper. It was for a travel plaza with an address listed as mile marker 348, I-10, New Mexico, elevation 127 feet. The tagline at the bottom read, "We're always here when you need us." On the back, written in his own handwriting, was a date 3 months in the future and the words, "See you then." That date is next week. Raymond has taken vacation time. He's not driving. He's not going anywhere near I-10. But he started having dreams where he's at the fuel stop. And this time, he's one of the synchronized diners, eating in perfect unison with the others, watching as a new truck pulls in, watching as a new driver walks through those automatic doors, watching as someone else learns that some fuel stops exist outside the normal flow of time and space, and that once you stop there, part of you never really leaves. Story 4. The Mile Marker Countdown. Patricia Huang had been in the trucking industry for 15 years, starting as a dispatcher before getting her CDL and moving into driving full-time. She preferred night driving, enjoyed the solitude, and the way the highway belonged to truckers in the dark hours. She was methodical and careful, never taking risks, always following the rules. That attention to detail is probably what kept her alive when she encountered the countdown on Highway 395 in California. It was October 31st, 2018, Halloween night, though Patricia didn't put much stock in superstition. She was hauling computer components from Sacramento to Reno, a straightforward run up Interstate 80, but there was a closure due to early snow in the Sierra. The detour routed her south to Highway 395, a route she'd taken before but not frequently. She left Sacramento at 8 p.m., expecting to reach Reno by midnight. The highway was quiet, traffic light even for a holiday. As she passed through the small town of Susanville and headed into the more remote stretches, she began her usual habit of reading mile markers out loud, a trick an old mentor had taught her to stay alert during night driving. "Mile marker 187, she said as one passed. Then a few minutes later, mile marker 185. She continued north, the mile markers counting down as expected. 180. 175. 170. The numbers descended regularly as she put miles behind her. She was approaching the Oregon border, which should have been around mile marker 165 based on her memory of the route. That's when the pattern changed. She read mile marker 168, then a minute later, mile marker 166. The next marker should have been 164, but when it appeared in her headlights, it read 157. She skipped forward. That wasn't right. Mile markers were spaced exactly 1 mile apart. You couldn't skip them unless there was construction or an error in placement. Patricia made a note of it and continued driving. The next marker read 154. 3 miles, that was correct. Then 151. Then 147. Another skip. She was starting to feel uneasy, though she couldn't articulate why. They were just numbers, markers to help drivers track their position. But the skipping bothered her, broke the rhythm she relied on. Mile marker 143, then 138, then 132. Each skip was getting larger. She checked her GPS, but it showed her position as normal, moving steadily north on Highway 395. Her odometer was tracking miles normally. But the markers were descending faster than they should. Then she saw it. Mile marker 100. She jumped from 132 to 100 in what felt like just a couple of miles. And something else was wrong. The landscape had changed. The terrain along this stretch should have been forested, pine trees crowding the highway. Instead, she was driving through a landscape she didn't recognize, flat and desolate, with twisted trees that looked dead silhouetted against the night sky. Mile marker 95 appeared. Then less than 30 seconds later, marker 90. They were accelerating. Patricia's heart began to race. She tried the CB radio. "Anyone on 395, this is Northern Star, you got your ears on." Static. She tried her cell phone. No signal. Marker 85. Marker 79. Marker 72. They were coming faster now, appearing every few seconds. The numbers were counting down at an impossible rate, far faster than she could possibly be driving. And with each marker, the landscape grew stranger. The dead trees were closer to the road now, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The pavement beneath her wheels was crumbling, pitted with holes that shouldn't exist on a maintained highway. Marker 65. Marker 58. Marker 51. Patricia's speedometer showed 70 miles per hour, but the markers suggested she was traveling impossibly fast, or the distance between them was shrinking. She didn't know which possibility was more terrifying. At marker 50, she saw something else. Other vehicles on the side of the road. Not modern cars or trucks, but older vehicles. A sedan that looked like it was from the 1960s. A pickup truck from the 1940s. An old transport truck from an even earlier era. All abandoned, all rusted and decayed, all positioned as if their drivers had simply pulled over and walked away. Marker 45, marker 40, marker 35. The countdown was accelerating. She tried to slow down, but her truck wouldn't respond. The throttle was locked at 70. The brakes had no effect. She was trapped at a constant speed while the mile markers rushed by with increasing frequency. At marker 30, she started seeing figures standing by the roadside. People or things shaped like people, their forms indistinct in the darkness. They stood motionless, watching her pass, and there were more of them at each marker. By marker 25, they lined both sides of the highway, a corridor of silent watchers. Patricia's hands were locked on the steering wheel, her whole body rigid with terror. She wanted to close her eyes but couldn't, needed to see what was coming, needed to prepare for whatever waited at marker 0. Marker 20. The figures were closer now, almost at the edge of the pavement. She could see they weren't wearing clothes, their skin pale and smooth like marble, their faces featureless except for dark holes where eyes should be. Marker 15. The highway ahead was narrowing, the edges crumbling away into darkness. Her truck was driving down what was essentially a bridge of asphalt suspended over nothing. Marker 10. The figures were reaching out now, their arms extending toward her truck as she passed, long fingers with too many joints stretching toward her windows. Marker 5. Patricia could see something ahead, a structure or formation blocking the highway. As she got closer, she realized it was a wall, solid and impenetrable, stretching infinitely in both directions. She was going to hit it. At 70 miles per hour, she was going to crash into that wall, and there was nothing she could do. Marker 1. The wall filled her vision. The figures had moved onto the highway itself, no longer just watching but moving toward her, surrounding her truck. Patricia screamed, a sound that came from somewhere primal and ancient, the sound every human makes when facing their mortality. Marker 0 flashed by. Patricia closed her eyes and braced for impact. The truck hit something. She felt the collision through every bone in her body, a tremendous force that should have killed her instantly. But she didn't die. She opened her eyes. She was still on Highway 395, but the sun was rising. The landscape was normal, forested and green and familiar. Her speedometer showed 70. Her GPS showed her position as correct. There were other vehicles on the highway, normal morning traffic. She pulled over at the first rest area she reached, her entire body shaking. According to her truck's clock, it was 6:30 a.m. 8.5 hours had passed since she'd entered the detour. A trip that should have taken 3 hours had somehow consumed an entire night. She checked herself for injuries. There were none. Her truck was undamaged. Everything was normal except for one detail. Her odometer had gained exactly 1,000 miles since she'd entered the detour. She'd driven 1,000 miles on a 200-mile stretch of highway. Patricia called her dispatcher, told them she needed to take some time off, personal emergency. She drove home and didn't get back in a truck for 6 weeks. When she finally returned to work, she took different routes, avoided Highway 395 entirely. But the dream started immediately. Every night she dreamed of driving, of seeing mile markers counting down, always counting down, never reaching 0. The numbers would descend into negatives. Marker 10, marker 50, marker 100. And the deeper into negative numbers she went, the darker the landscape became, the more figures gathered at the roadside, watching, waiting. She started researching the highway, digging through old records and news articles. She found references to disappearances along that stretch. Drivers who'd taken the detour and never arrived at their destinations. Vehicles found abandoned with no trace of their occupants. The incidents stretched back decades, occurring irregularly, maybe once every few years. And she found one other thing. an old survey map from when Highway 395 was first constructed in the 1930s. The original plan had included a section that was never built, a stretch that was supposed to connect to a proposed town that was never established. The planned mile markers for that unbuilt section ranged from 100 to 0, ending at the location where the town was supposed to be. Patricia keeps that map in her truck now. It's a reminder that some roads exist in planning, in potential, in the spaces between what is and what might have been. And sometimes, under the right conditions on the right night, those potential roads become real, and drivers find themselves traveling not just through space, but through all the abandoned possibilities that haunt the edges of reality. She still drives at night, still calls out mile markers to stay alert, but now she pays very close attention to the numbers. If they ever start counting down too fast, if they ever begin skipping forward in that particular pattern, she's decided she'll close her eyes and keep them closed until she crashes, until she reaches marker 0 and whatever lies beyond it. Because she knows now that some countdowns don't end in destruction. They end in something worse: continuation, eternal driving on highways that never end, through landscapes that should never exist, watched by figures that were never quite human to begin with. Story 5. The Duplicate Delivery. Frank Morrison had been an independent owner-operator for 19 years, running his own truck and building a reputation for reliability. He specialized in time-sensitive deliveries, was the guy companies called when something absolutely had to arrive on schedule. His record was flawless. In 19 years, he'd never missed a delivery window. That perfect record was shattered on March 8, 2022, when he made the same delivery twice to an address that didn't exist. The job seemed straightforward. A manufacturing company in Detroit needed specialized machinery parts delivered to a facility in rural Pennsylvania. The payment was generous, the timeline reasonable, and the paperwork all checked out. Frank loaded the cargo, 19 sealed crates weighing a total of 15,000 pounds, and left Detroit at 6 a.m. on a clear Tuesday morning. The drive was uneventful. He made good time across Ohio, stopped for fuel and a meal in Youngstown, and crossed into Pennsylvania in the early afternoon. The GPS directed him off the interstate onto state highways, then onto progressively smaller roads winding through hills and forest. This wasn't unusual. Manufacturing facilities were often located in remote areas where land was cheap and transportation costs minimized by proximity to raw materials. The facility appeared exactly where the GPS indicated, at the end of a long gravel road. It was modern and nondescript, a large metal building with no signage, surrounded by a chain-link fence. A guard station controlled access to the gate. Frank pulled up and presented his paperwork to the security guard, a middle-aged man with a tired expression. "Frank Morrison, delivering from Detroit," he said, handing over the manifest. The guard studied the paperwork, then looked up at Frank with an odd expression. "You're early," he said. "Schedule said deliver by 6 p.m. It's only 3. "Right, okay. Bay 7 around the left side. They'll unload you there." The guard opened the gate and Frank drove through, following signs to the loading docks. Bay 7's door was open, and several workers in blue coveralls emerged to help unload. The process was efficient and professional. Within 40 minutes, all 19 crates were off his trailer and stacked on pallets. A supervisor signed the delivery confirmation, handed Frank his paperwork, and that was that. Frank pulled out of the facility at 3:45 p.m., satisfied with a job well done. He drove back down the gravel road toward the state highway, planning his route back to Detroit. That's when things started to feel wrong. He reached the end of the gravel road where it met the state highway, but when he looked at his GPS, it showed he was in a different location than he should be. The map indicated he was still on the gravel road, but about 5 miles farther back, closer to the facility. He chalked it up to GPS lag and turned onto the highway, heading west. After about 30 minutes of driving, his phone rang. It was the dispatcher from the manufacturing company that had hired him. "Frank, we've got a problem. The facility in Pennsylvania says you haven't arrived yet. Your delivery window closes in 2 hours. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "That's impossible. I just made the delivery. I've got signed paperwork confirming it. Can you send me a photo of the confirmation?" Frank pulled over, grabbed the paperwork from his folder, and took a photo with his phone. As he looked at the delivery confirmation, he noticed something odd. The signature was there, but the timestamp showed 6:00 p.m., not 3:45 p.m. when he'd actually left. He sent the photo to the dispatcher and waited. The response came quickly. "Frank, that signature isn't from anyone who works at that facility, and the timestamp is in the future. Where exactly are you right now?" Frank looked around. He was on a state highway in Pennsylvania, that much was certain. But the road number on the signs didn't match what his GPS was showing. "I'm heading back west. I need to check my location." He pulled out a paper map, old-school navigation he always kept as backup. According to the map and the road signs around him, he was about 60 miles east of where the facility should be. But that made no sense. He'd just driven away from it. Frank made a decision. He turned the truck around and headed back toward the facility, following his tire tracks in the gravel on the shoulder, retracing his exact route. After 40 minutes, he found the gravel road and turned down it. The facility appeared after 2 miles, exactly where it had been before, but something was different. The gate was closed and there was no guard station. The building was dark, looking abandoned. Frank got out of his truck and walked to the fence. Through the chain link, he could see the loading bays all closed. There was no indication anyone had been there recently. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement. Windows were grimy with accumulated dirt. His phone rang again. The dispatcher. "Frank, the facility just called. They need to know your ETA. The parts are critical for a production run that starts tonight." "I'm at the facility right now," Frank said. "But it's abandoned. No one's here." "What address are you at?" Frank read the numbers from the GPS. There was a long pause. "Frank, that's not the address. You're at the old facility. It was shut down 8 years ago. The new facility is 20 miles south. I'm sending you the correct coordinates now." New coordinates appeared on Frank's phone. He plotted them on his GPS. They showed a location distinctly different from where he currently was, but the address was identical. Same road name, same number, just a different location. Frank felt reality tilting around him. He delivered the cargo somewhere. He had paperwork confirming it. But according to everyone else, he hadn't made the delivery and the place he'd been to didn't exist anymore. He drove to the coordinates for the new facility. It took 30 minutes. When he arrived, it looked identical to the first location. Modern metal building, chain link fence, guard station. The same tired-looking guard was at the gate. "Frank Morrison, delivering from Detroit," he said, experiencing the most intense déjà vu of his life. The guard looked at him strangely. "You called an hour ago saying you were lost. Glad you found us. Bay 7 around the left side." Frank drove to Bay 7 with a growing sense of unreality. The loading dock was empty. His trailer was still empty, but he'd already unloaded everything. He opened the rear doors of his trailer and his breath caught in his throat. The 19 crates were there. All of them, secured exactly as they'd been when he'd left Detroit that morning. Impossible. He'd watched them being unloaded. He stood there as workers moved each crate off his trailer. The workers arrived to unload, the same people in blue coveralls, going through the same efficient process. Frank watched in a daze as they removed the crates for the second time. The supervisor approached with paperwork, and Frank saw it was a different person than before, a younger man, but going through the same motions. The supervisor signed the confirmation. Frank looked at the timestamp, 5:45 p.m., 15 minutes before the deadline. He'd made it in time, but something fundamental about reality had broken in the process. He He drove away from the facility at 6:15 p.m., his hands shaking on the steering wheel. This time, when he reached the state highway, his GPS showed the correct location. The road numbers matched. Everything was normal. He called the dispatcher, confirmed the delivery was complete, and headed back to Detroit. But Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had changed. He'd been to a facility that didn't exist, unloaded cargo that was still in his trailer, talked to people who weren't there. Somewhere, in some version of Pennsylvania, there was an abandoned facility that now held 19 crates of machinery parts that simultaneously existed in the real facility 20 miles away. He started researching the old facility when he got home. It had indeed been shut down 8 years prior after some kind of accident. Several workers had been killed when a machine malfunctioned. The company had relocated, built a new facility in a different location, but kept the same address for business continuity purposes. Frank found an old photo of the workers who died in the accident. His blood ran cold as he recognized faces. The tired guard, the workers in blue coveralls, the supervisor who'd signed his paperwork. All of them had died 8 years ago. He checked his truck's odometer. From the time he'd left Detroit to the time he'd arrived back, he'd driven 847 miles. The round trip should have been 620 miles. He traveled an extra 227 miles, going to a facility that didn't exist anymore, meeting people who were dead, delivering cargo that remained in his trailer the entire time. Frank still takes jobs, still makes deliveries, but he's developed a superstition. He never accepts jobs to facilities that have relocated. He researches every address to make sure there's only one location associated with it. Because he knows now that some addresses exist in multiple realities, that some places continue operating in the shadows of what once was, staffed by people who don't know they're gone, accepting deliveries that arrive from a world they no longer inhabit. And sometimes, when he passes abandoned buildings in remote areas, he sees trucks in the parking lots, sees workers moving around inside through dirty windows, sees a version of the industry that continues in parallel to the real one, forever making deliveries to places that existed once and somehow never stopped existing, trapped in an eternal loop of logistics and labor that death itself couldn't interrupt. Story 6. The truck stop that moves. Gerald Washington had been driving long haul for 26 years, and in that time he developed a mental map of every good truck stop between Texas and Maine. He had favorites in every state, places where the food was decent, the showers clean, and the parking secure. He recommended these stops to countless other drivers, had written reviews online, had spent thousands of hours parked at these familiar locations. That's why it was so disturbing when one of his favorite truck stops began appearing in places it shouldn't be. The truck stop was called Wanderer's Rest, located just off Interstate 40 in Tennessee, right at mile marker 276. Gerald had been stopping there for over a decade. It was independently owned, run by a couple named Dave and Susan Hartley, and it had a reputation among drivers for being honest and well-maintained. The food was good, prices fair, and the place had a character that corporate chain stops lacked. On April 15, 2021, Gerald was running a route from Houston to Baltimore, hauling construction equipment. He was ahead of schedule, making good time, and decided to stop for dinner and a rest. He knew Wanderer's Rest would be perfect, should be coming up in about 30 miles as he passed through Tennessee. But when he reached mile marker 276, there was nothing there. The exit existed, but when he took it, the truck stop was gone. In its place was an empty lot overgrown with weeds as if nothing had ever been built there. Gerald sat in his truck, confused and unsettled. He de-stopped at this location maybe 50 times over the years. It couldn't just be gone. He called information, got a number for Wanderer's Rest, and dialed. The phone rang and Dave Hartley answered. "Wanderer's Rest, how can I help you?" "Dave, it's Gerald Washington. I'm at exit 276, but your truck stop isn't here. What happened? There was a long pause. Gerald, you're where? Exit 276, mile marker 276 on I-40 in Tennessee, where I always stop. Gerald, we haven't been at that location for 8 years. We moved. How do you not know this? Moved where? Arkansas. We're just off I-40 near Little Rock now. Have been since 2013. Gerald felt reality slipping sideways. He de-stopped at the Tennessee location just 2 months ago. He was sure of it. He had receipts, credit card statements, memories of conversations with Dave and Susan. I was there in February, he said. Not possible, friend. Building was demolished in 2013. We relocated the business. You want the new address? Gerald took down the Arkansas location and ended the call, his hands shaking. He looked at the empty lot through his windshield. He could almost see the truck stop overlaid on the emptiness, a ghost image of the building that should be there. He continued his route, shaken but trying to rationalize. Maybe he'd misremembered. Maybe he'd been stopping at the Arkansas location and his memory had gotten confused. It had been a long career. Details could blur together. 3 weeks later, Gerald was running a route from Atlanta to Chicago. Late evening, looking for a place to stop for the night, he saw signs for Wanderers Rest announcing a truck stop ahead. But he was on Interstate 75 in Kentucky, nowhere near either Tennessee or Arkansas. He took the exit, driven by curiosity and a growing sense of dread. The truck stop was there. Wanderers Rest, exactly as he remembered it from Tennessee. Same building layout, same red roof, same illuminated sign. He pulled into the parking lot and sat for a long moment trying to understand what he was seeing. He went inside. Dave Hartley was behind the counter, older than Gerald remembered, but definitely him. Gerald, Dave said with a smile. Haven't seen you in a while. The usual. Dave, where are we? Dave looked confused. Kentucky, just off 75. You feeling okay? You told me 3 weeks ago you'd been in Arkansas since 2013. Dave's smile faded. I don't know what you're talking about. We've been at this location for 5 years. Moved here from Tennessee. When did you leave Tennessee? 2013, like I said. Gerald ordered food, his appetite gone but needing time to think. He ate mechanically, watching other drivers come and go. Everything seemed normal except he was in a truck stop that shouldn't exist in this location. He left at midnight, the experience leaving him deeply unsettled. Over the next several months, Gerald began documenting every time he saw Wanderers Rest. He took photos, saved GPS coordinates, kept meticulous records. The truck stop appeared 17 times in 8 different states, always on Interstate 40 or Interstate 75, but in locations that varied. Sometimes it was at the Tennessee site, sometimes Arkansas, sometimes Kentucky or Virginia or Texas or North Carolina. The appearances followed no pattern he could discern. He might pass the Tennessee location and find nothing, then 4 hours later see the truck stop in a completely different state. He tried asking other drivers if they'd seen it, but responses were mixed. Some confirmed they'd stopped there. Others insisted there was no truck stop at the locations Gerald described. He became obsessed with understanding the phenomenon. He researched the history of the business, traced the ownership back decades. Wanderers Rest had been established in 1967, had been in the same Tennessee location for 46 years before relocating to Arkansas. But according to his documentation, it now existed in multiple locations simultaneously, or moved between locations in ways that violated geography and logic. The most disturbing incident occurred on a cold night in January 2022. Gerald was running empty from New York to pick up a load in Texas. He was on Interstate 40 in North Carolina, exhausted after 14 hours of driving when he saw the Wanderers Rest signs. He pulled in, grateful for a familiar place to rest. The parking lot was full, maybe 40 trucks, all parked for the night. Gerald found a spot, shut down his engine and went inside. The restaurant was busy with drivers eating and socializing. Dave was behind the counter as always. Everything was normal. Gerald ordered coffee and sat in a booth, planning to rest for a few hours before continuing. He dozed off, the caffeine not enough to combat his exhaustion. When he woke, it was getting light outside, the sun just starting to rise. He de-slept longer than intended, maybe 5 hours. He went to his truck, ready to leave. The parking lot was empty except for his truck. All 40 vehicles that had been there when he'd arrived were gone. He went back inside. The restaurant was empty. No Dave, no staff, no other drivers. But the lights were on, coffee fresh in the pot, food laid out on the buffet. "Hello," he called, no response. He walked through the building. The convenience store was fully stocked. The showers were clean and ready. Everything was operating, but no one was there. He went back outside and walked around the building. There were no recent tire tracks except his own. The other trucks had left no trace of their presence. Gerald got in his truck and left quickly, his heart pounding. He drove for an hour before pulling over and checking his GPS history. According to the data, he'd never stopped. The GPS showed him passing through that area of North Carolina without interruption, but he'd been there. He had a receipt for the coffee on the dash, stamped with the Wanderers Rest logo and a North Carolina address. He called the phone number for Wanderers Rest. Dave answered. "Hey Gerald," calling for directions again. "Dave, where am I right now? How should I know? Where are you right now?" "Arkansas, where we always are. You need to get some rest, friend. You sound stressed." Gerald looked at the receipt on his dash. It listed an Arkansas address. The same address Dave had given him months ago. But he'd gotten this receipt in North Carolina, hadn't he? He tried to remember, but the memory was becoming fuzzy, uncertain. Since that night, Gerald has seen Wanderers Rest another dozen times, in locations spanning from California to Maine. He stops sometimes when he's too tired to care about the impossibility. The staff is always friendly, the food always good, the facilities always clean. Other drivers are usually there, though he's learned not to ask them too many questions about where they think they are. He's developed a theory, though he knows it sounds insane. Some places don't stay in one location. They exist in a kind of mobile state, appearing where they're needed when they're needed. Wanderers Rest is a truck stop for drivers who are lost, exhausted, desperate. It appears on routes where no other services exist, provides sanctuary in the middle of nowhere, then moves on to help others. The alternative theory, which he tries not to think about, is that he's the one who's lost, not the truck stop. That's somewhere along thousands of miles of highway. He took a wrong turn not just in space but in reality itself. And now, he drives through a version of America where truck stops can appear and disappear, where familiar places exist in unfamiliar locations, where the laws of geography are more flexible than maps suggest. Gerald still drives, still makes his deliveries, still sees Wanderers Rest appearing in his future like a recurring dream. He keeps the receipts, dozens of them now, each with a different address, each marking a moment when he stopped at an impossible location and found exactly what he needed. And late at night, when the highway is empty and his eyelids are heavy, he sometimes spots those familiar signs announcing a truck stop ahead, and he feels a mixture of relief and dread, because he knows that when he stops there, he'll be in a place that exists everywhere and nowhere, a sanctuary that moves through the network of America's highways like a ghost, forever offering rest to those who wander too far from home. Story 7. The Parallel Convoy. Mitchell Drake had been leading convoys for 18 years, working for a logistics company that specialized in moving oversized loads across the country. He was the escort driver, the guy who drove ahead in a pickup truck with warning lights, coordinating with state police, checking bridge clearances, making sure the route was clear. He'd guided massive industrial equipment, prefabricated houses, and even NASA rocket components. He was good at his job, methodical and careful. That expertise made what happened on Highway 50 in Nevada all the more inexplicable. The job was to escort a convoy of 6 trucks hauling disassembled wind turbine components from Kansas to California. The route took them across the loneliest stretch of highway in America, Nevada's Highway 50, famously called the loneliest road. Mitchell had done this route before, knew it well. The convoy was scheduled to make the crossing on September 16, 2019, starting at dawn. Everything went smoothly through the morning. The 6 trucks followed Mitchell in perfect formation, spaced properly, all drivers experienced and professional. They made their scheduled stop in Ely, Nevada, checked the equipment, grabbed lunch, and continued west. The afternoon was clear, temperature mild, conditions perfect. About 30 miles west of Ely, Mitchell saw something in his rearview mirror that made him do a double take. Behind the convoy, maybe half a mile back, was another convoy. Same configuration. 6 large trucks, 1 escort vehicle, all in the same formation he was leading. He called back to his convoy on the CB. "This is lead escort. Anyone know of another wind turbine convoy running today?" The responses from his drivers were all negative. This was a custom job, unique equipment, no other transports scheduled. Mitchell slowed down, letting the other convoy close the distance. As they got nearer, he began to notice details that made his skin crawl. The trucks in the other convoy looked identical to his trucks. Same makes and models, same configurations, same loads. The escort vehicle looked exactly like his pickup truck, down to the color and the light bar configuration. "Lead escort to convoy, we've got company behind us. Looks like they're running the same equipment we are." As the other convoy drew closer, Mitchell could see the drivers of the rear convoy through their windshields. They looked familiar, very familiar. He picked up his phone and zoomed in with the camera, taking photos of the approaching vehicles. When he looked at the images, his mouth went dry. The drivers were his drivers. He could see Tommy Richardson in the lead truck of the other convoy, the same Tommy Richardson who was in the lead truck of his convoy. He could see Janet Kowalski driving the third truck, identical to the Janet who was currently 100 yards behind Mitchell in position 3 of his formation. "Lead escort to all trucks. I need everyone to confirm your positions and sound off." One by one, his drivers called in, confirming they were exactly where they should be. But the other convoy was getting closer, and Mitchell could see all of them, duplicates of his entire team, driving identical trucks. The other convoy closed to within a few hundred feet and then matched speed, maintaining a consistent distance. They were driving in perfect synchronization, every movement mirrored. When one of Mitchell's trucks shifted lanes slightly to avoid road debris, the corresponding truck in the other convoy made the identical movement at the identical moment. Mitchell tried to slow down to let them pass. His convoy slowed. So did the other one, maintaining that exact spacing. He accelerated. They accelerated. He was leading not one convoy but 2, the second one a perfect reflection of the first, existing impossibly on the same road. "Okay, everybody stay calm," Mitchell said over the CB, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're going to proceed normally. Just maintain formation and keep moving." One of his drivers, Tommy, called back. "Mitchell, I can see them in my mirrors. That's my truck. That's me driving it." "I know, Tommy, just keep driving." For the next hour, they drove with their impossible shadows following. The duplicate convoy never varied its distance, never tried to pass, just maintained that precise formation. Other vehicles occasionally passed in the opposite direction, and Mitchell watched their reactions. Some seemed not to notice anything unusual. Others slowed down, drivers staring with obvious confusion at the duplicate convoys. Mitchell tried documenting the phenomenon, taking continuous video with his phone mounted on the dash. The footage clearly showed both convoys, the distances between them, the impossible duplication of vehicles and drivers. As they approached the small town of Austin, Nevada, Mitchell made a decision. "We're pulling off at the truck stop in Austin. Everyone follow me." He took the exit, watching carefully to see what the other convoy would do. His 6 trucks followed him off the highway as planned. The duplicate convoy continued straight, maintaining speed on Highway 50, eventually disappearing into the distance. The relief among the drivers was palpable. They parked at the truck stop, everyone getting out and gathering around Mitchell's truck. Janet was visibly shaken. I saw myself. I looked right at myself and she looked back, and we had the same expression of fear. Tommy was checking his truck obsessively, as if expecting to find something wrong. Were we looking at ghosts? Some kind of reflection? Mitchell didn't have answers. He reported the incident to their dispatcher, who was skeptical until Mitchell sent the video footage. The convoy took an extended break, everyone needing time to process what they'd experienced. After 2 hours, they agreed to continue. They needed to make California by the deadline, and staying in Austin wouldn't solve anything. Mitchell led the convoy back onto Highway 50, and for a while everything seemed normal. Just 6 trucks and an escort driving west through Nevada desert. Then Tommy called on the CB. "Mitchell, they're back." In his rearview mirror, Mitchell saw the duplicate convoy. It hadn't been on the highway. There was nowhere it could have been hiding. It had simply appeared, manifesting out of nothing at that same half-mile distance, matching their speed and formation perfectly. "All right, new plan," Mitchell said. "We're not stopping. We're running straight through to the California line. No more exits." The 2 convoys drove for the next 150 miles in tandem. The sun set, and in the darkness, the impossibility was even more pronounced. Mitchell could see 2 sets of headlights, 2 sets of running lights, perfect mirror images of his own convoy. Other drivers they encountered reacted with alarm. One trucker they passed was so distracted watching the dual convoys that he nearly drove off the road. As they approached the California border, something changed. The duplicate convoy began to fade. It wasn't sudden, wasn't like it disappeared. It was gradual, as if it was becoming transparent, less solid, less real. By the time they crossed into California, it was barely visible, ghost-like. And then it was gone entirely, leaving just the original convoy driving through the night. They made the delivery on time, the equipment unloaded and signed for. The company reviewed Mitchell's video footage and photos, brought in consultants, tried to find explanations. Optical phenomena, mirages, reflections from atmospheric conditions. None of the explanations fit what they'd all witnessed. Mitchell quit leading convoys 6 months later. He still drives, but solo work only, no more coordinating multi-truck operations. Because sometimes when he's driving alone at night, he sees another truck in his mirrors. It's always the same distance back, always matching his speed. Sometimes it's a truck he recognizes, one he drove years ago. Sometimes it's his current truck, impossible as that is. He's developed a theory that he shares reluctantly, knowing how it sounds. The highways we drive are not the only roads. There are parallel roads existing alongside ours, maybe overlapping in places. Most of the time, the roads are separate, distinct. But sometimes, under certain conditions, they align. When they do, travelers can see across the boundary, can witness the parallel journey happening just out of reach. The other convoy on Highway 50 wasn't a duplicate of Mitchell's convoy. It was his convoy, existing simultaneously in 2 realities, the boundary between worlds thin enough that both versions could perceive each other. Somewhere in that other world, Mitchell's duplicate is telling the same story, describing the inexplicable appearance of another convoy that matched theirs perfectly before fading away at the border. And late at night, on the loneliest roads in America, if you look carefully in your mirrors, you might see yourself. Not your reflection, yourself. Driving alongside you in the same vehicle on the same road, living the same life just slightly out of sync. Most people dismiss it as tiredness, as tricks of light and shadow. But Mitchell knows better. He's seen the roads that exist in parallel to ours, and he knows that every journey we make, we're making alongside versions of ourselves that exist in possibilities we never chose, futures we never lived, but that remain real nonetheless, driving through a night that never ends on roads that have no single destination. Story 8. The radio broadcast from nowhere. Vincent Torres had been a long-haul trucker for 14 years, and music was his constant companion on the road. He had satellite radio, streaming subscriptions, and an extensive collection of downloaded podcasts. But he preferred AM radio, particularly late at night, when strange, distant stations would fade in and out, their signals bouncing off the ionosphere, bringing voices from hundreds or thousands of miles away. There was something romantic about it, connecting with distant places through nothing but radio waves. That romanticism died on December 11th, 2020, when he tuned into a station that shouldn't exist. Vincent was hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals from Phoenix to Minneapolis, a route that took him through the empty expanses of northern Arizona and into New Mexico. It was 2 a.m., the highway deserted, his only company the hum of his engine and the stars overhead. He was scanning through AM frequencies, looking for something to keep him alert, when he landed on a station at 940 kHz. The signal was remarkably clear for AM radio, no static or fading, as if the transmitter was close by. A woman's voice was speaking, calm and measured. And if you're just joining us on KNWH, we're continuing our coverage of the incident on Interstate 40. Authorities are still requesting that all travelers avoid the area between mile markers 140 and 180. The highway remains closed while emergency personnel work to contain the situation. Vincent was on Interstate 40, but much farther west than the mile markers mentioned. He was approaching Flagstaff, around mile marker 195. Whatever incident the radio was covering was ahead of him. He turned up the volume, paying careful attention. The woman continued, "We have reports that the closure may extend for another 6 to 8 hours. Governor Richards has declared a state of emergency for the affected counties. For those just tuning in at approximately 10:30 p.m. tonight, a series of events began that authorities are still working to understand. We're going to turn now to our field reporter, James Chen, who is at the closure point near mile marker 180. James, what can you tell us?" A male voice came on, wind noise audible in the background. "Sarah, the scene here is difficult to describe. The highway is blocked by law enforcement from multiple agencies. I can see at least 20 police vehicles, several ambulances, and what appear to be military trucks. No one is being allowed past this point. The official explanation is that there's been a hazmat spill, but that doesn't explain the equipment I'm seeing or the level of response." Vincent frowned. A hazmat spill big enough to close 40 miles of interstate would be major news. He checked his phone for alerts. Nothing. No emergency notifications, no traffic warnings, no news stories about any incident on I-40. The reporter continued, "I've spoken to several truckers who were already on that stretch of highway when the closure went into effect. They were escorted off at exit 167 and were told they couldn't return to their vehicles. One driver, I won't use his name, told me he saw something on the highway that he couldn't explain. He described it as a section of road that was somehow wrong. He couldn't articulate it better than that. Just wrong." Sarah's voice returned. "James, what about the reports of missing travelers? Are authorities confirming that anyone is unaccounted for?" "Officials aren't confirming anything specific, but I've counted at least 12 vehicles parked at the closure point with concerned family members. People whose loved ones entered that stretch of highway and never emerged from the other end. Cell phones going straight to voicemail, GPS trackers showing last locations in the closed zone, and then nothing." Vincent felt a chill run through him. The closure was ahead of him. If he kept driving, he'd reach it in about 15 minutes. He checked his GPS again, looking for alternate routes, but there were no good options. The detour would add hours to his trip, and his delivery schedule was tight. The radio broadcast continued. "We're getting reports now that the military has established a perimeter around the entire affected area. Helicopters are circling overhead, though it's unclear what they're looking for. We've reached out to the National Guard for comment, but they're referring all questions to state police, who are referring questions to federal authorities, who are declining to comment. This had to be real, right? The broadcast was too detailed, too specific to be some kind of hoax. Vincent looked ahead at the highway. Traffic was light but present. He could see taillights of other vehicles, could occasionally pass cars heading in the opposite direction. Everything looked normal. Where was this massive closure? Where were all the emergency vehicles? He passed exit 190, then 185. According to the radio, he should be approaching the closure. But the highway stretched ahead, clear and open, no signs of any problems. The female anchor's voice had taken on an urgent tone. "James, we're getting new information. Can you confirm that authorities have ordered evacuation of the town of Holbrook?" "I'm hearing the same reports, Sarah, though I want to stress we haven't received official confirmation. But I am seeing what looks like convoy of emergency vehicles heading east toward Holbrook." Vincent was approaching mile marker 180, which according to the radio should be a closure point. But there was nothing. No police cars, no emergency vehicles, no closure. The highway was open and normal. He drove through mile marker 180, then 175, entering the zone that was supposedly closed. The radio broadcast was becoming more frantic. "We're now receiving reports of a second affected zone opening up near mile marker 120. Authorities are struggling to contain the situation. We're being told that under no circumstances should anyone attempt to enter the closed areas." Vincent was in the closed area. He was supposedly in the middle of a massive emergency response, yet the highway around him was normal. A few other trucks and cars were driving along, no one showing any signs of distress or awareness of a problem. Then the radio changed. The anchor's voice became distorted, slowed down as if the playback speed was decreasing. "We're now getting reports." The words stretched out, deepening in pitch. And underneath the distorted voice, Vincent could hear something else, screaming. Multiple voices, distant but distinct, screaming in terror. He reached for the radio to change stations, but before he could touch the dial, the station snapped back to normal. The anchor was mid-sentence, asking everyone to remain calm. "We know this situation is unprecedented, but panic will only make things worse." Vincent passed mile marker 175. He checked his GPS again. It showed his location as correct, showed him moving normally down I-40. But the mile markers were wrong. He just passed 180, then 175, descending as they should. But the radio had said the affected zone was between markers 140 and 180. The numbers should be increasing, not decreasing if he was heading east. Unless he wasn't heading east anymore. Vincent looked at his compass, an old mechanical one mounted on his dash, a gift from his father. It showed him heading west. But according to his GPS, his route, and the sun's position before it had set, he should be heading northeast. The compass was wrong. It had to be wrong. The radio. "James, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We've just received word that the situation has escalated. The area between mile markers 140 and 180 is now considered." I'm being told to phrase this carefully. Is now considered non-contiguous with surrounding geography. "Sarah, I'm not sure I understand what that means." "Neither am I, James. We're reading from a statement provided by federal authorities. The affected zone is described as non-contiguous. Travel into or out of the zone is not currently possible. Authorities are attempting to establish what they're calling stability protocols, but they're refusing to explain what that means." Vincent passed mile marker 170, then 165. He was going deeper into the supposedly closed zone, and everything was normal, except it was. He was starting to notice small details that were wrong. The highway signs were slightly different, the fonts not quite right. The mile markers were the correct shape and color, but positioned differently than they should be. The road surface looked new, too new as if it had just been paved, yet his route schedule showed this section was due for resurfacing next year. He tried his phone again, thinking he'd call his dispatcher, get clarification on whether there really was a closure ahead. No signal. Not just weak signal, but nothing. The phone showed no bars, no indication it was even trying to connect to a network. The radio broadcast was deteriorating. The anchor's voice kept cutting out, replaced by bursts of static and those horrible distant screams. The situation static, recommending all residents screaming, impossible to static, God help us all static. Then a new voice came through the speakers, low and somehow wrong, as if it was coming from something that had learned to make human sounds but didn't truly understand speech. Vincent Tours, Interstate 40, refrigerated pharmaceuticals, Phoenix to Minneapolis. You're in the wrong place, Vincent. You've driven into somewhere that isn't anywhere. The road looks the same, but it's not your road anymore. Vincent slammed on the brakes, his truck shuddering to a stop on the highway. He stared at the radio, his heart hammering in his chest. The station display showed 940 kHz, but when he checked his radio presets, that frequency wasn't used by any station in this region. There was no KNWH. He pulled up his phone's browser using his downloaded offline map. No radio station at that frequency within 500 miles of his location. The voice continued. Behind you are 18 vehicles. Ahead of you are 24. All of them drove into this place at different times, but now you're all here together. Some have been driving for hours, some for days, some longer. Time is flexible here. Miles are negotiable. You're still moving, but you're not going anywhere. Vincent looked in his mirrors. He could see headlights behind him, vehicles approaching. As they passed, he saw normal cars and trucks, drivers who looked stressed and exhausted but not panicked. Were they all trapped in this place, whatever it was? The radio. You have two choices, Vincent. Keep driving, hope you find an exit before your fuel runs out, before you become one of the permanent residents of this impossible stretch of highway. Or pull over and wait. Others have waited. You'll see them eventually. Parked forever on the shoulder, drivers still sitting in their cabs, still waiting for rescue that never comes. Vincent looked ahead. In the distance, he could see vehicles parked on the shoulder, multiple trucks and cars just sitting there. As he watched, a sedan passed him and began to slow, pulling to the shoulder and stopping, joining the other parked vehicles. "I'm going to find a way out," Vincent said aloud, his voice shaking. He put the truck in gear and accelerated, pushing up to 70 miles per hour, desperate to find the end of this zone and return to the real Interstate 40. The radio broadcast had devolved into pure chaos, multiple voices speaking over each other, screams and static, and that horrible inhuman voice repeating, non-contiguous, over and over. Vincent turned the radio off, plunging himself into silence broken only by his engine noise. He drove for 3 hours, burning through fuel faster than he should. The mile markers continued to descend, 150, 140, 130. He never reached marker 120, where the broadcast had said a second affected zone was opening. The markers simply stopped at 125, and then there were no more. Just highway stretching endlessly ahead, perfect and new and wrong. He passed hundreds of parked vehicles. Saw more cars and trucks pulling over, their drivers giving up. Saw people standing outside their vehicles, waving desperately as he passed, begging for help he couldn't provide. Then, without warning, everything snapped back. One moment he was on the impossible highway, the next he was passing mile marker 173 heading northeast on the real Interstate 40. Other vehicles surrounded him, normal traffic, everyone driving like nothing strange had happened. His phone showed full signal. His GPS showed the correct location. His fuel gauge showed he'd used only the amount expected for his journey. Vincent pulled off at the next truck stop, his entire body shaking with adrenaline come down. He sat in the parking lot for 2 hours trying to process what had happened. He searched for news about any incident on I-40. Nothing. No closures, no emergencies, no reports of missing travelers. But when he scrolled through his radio's preset stations, he found 940 kHz was still there. He pressed the button. Static. He was about to switch away when a voice came through, faint and distant. Interstate 40 between mile markers 140 and 180 remains closed. Authorities now estimate it may be permanent. The geography simply won't reconnect. They're considering abandoning that section, routing traffic around it, pretending it never existed. What else can they do with a piece of highway that's come untethered from reality? Vincent deleted the preset. Changed trucks a month later, couldn't stand being in that cab anymore. He still drives I-40 sometimes. His roots require it. But he never listens to AM radio anymore, and he always makes sure his fuel tank is full before entering Arizona. Because he knows now that some of the roads we drive exist in states of uncertainty, that there are stretches of highway that might not be firmly connected to the geography around them, that could at any moment slip away into impossible elsewheres, taking drivers with them. And late at night, when he's alone on empty highways, his radio turned off, he sometimes hears that voice anyway, not from speakers but from the air itself, announcing incidents that haven't happened yet or are happening in places that exist sideways to reality. He doesn't listen. He just drives, watching his mile markers, making sure they're counting in the right direction, praying that his road stays connected to the world he knows. Story 9. The Endless Inspection. Robert Mendez had been a certified DOT inspector for 21 years before he started driving trucks himself. He knew the regulations inside and out, could spot violations from 50 feet away, and had written thousands of citations for unsafe vehicles. When he switched to driving, that expertise made him meticulous about his own truck's compliance. Every inspection, every maintenance record, everything was perfect. That attention to detail should have helped him when he got pulled into the inspection station that didn't follow any rules he knew. It was February 9th, 2023, early morning on Interstate 15 in Utah, when Robert saw the signs announcing a weigh station ahead. He was hauling electronics from Salt Lake City to Las Vegas, running slightly ahead of schedule, and he had no concerns about the inspection. His logs were current, his truck was in perfect condition, his cargo properly secured. He passed DOT inspections dozens of times with 0 violations. The weigh station appeared normal, a standard facility with scales and inspection bays. The electronic signs directed him to pull in, which was typical for commercial vehicles. Robert rolled across the scales, his weight well within legal limits, and waited for the green light to proceed. Instead, a red light flashed and an arrow directed him to Inspection Bay 3. Again, not unusual. Random inspections were part of the job. Robert pulled into the bay and shut down his engine as a uniformed inspector approached. The inspector was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing what looked like a standard DOT uniform. But something about him was off. His movements were too precise, too mechanical, and his eyes had a flat, emotionless quality. "License, registration, and logbook," the inspector said, his voice lacking any inflection. Robert provided the documents. The inspector studied them for an unnaturally long time, his eyes moving over the pages without blinking. Finally, he looked up. "I'm going to need to perform a detailed vehicle inspection. Please step out of the cab." This was standard procedure. Robert complied, watching as the inspector began examining his truck. The inspection was thorough, more thorough than any Robert had experienced. The inspector checked every single bolt, every connection, every wire. He measured tire tread depths to ridiculous precision. He crawled under the truck and stayed there for 15 minutes, examining the undercarriage in minute detail. After an hour, the inspector emerged and began checking the cargo. Robert opened the trailer, and the inspector climbed inside with a clipboard and measuring tools. Robert waited, getting progressively more uneasy. He could hear the inspector moving around inside, the sound of boxes being shifted, tape being cut. Another 2 hours passed. Robert tried asking how much longer the inspection would take, but the inspector ignored him. Other trucks came and went from the weigh station, receiving green lights and waving through. Only Robert's truck remained under inspection. Finally, the inspector emerged from the trailer. "I've found discrepancies," he said. "Your cargo weights don't match the manifest within acceptable tolerances." "What discrepancies?" Robert asked. "Everything was weighed at loading. Box 47 in row 6 weighs 43.2 pounds. Your manifest lists it as 43 pounds. That's a documentation error." Robert stared at him. "You're talking about a difference of 0.2 pounds. That's within any reasonable margin of error. The regulations require accuracy. I'm citing you for improper documentation. You'll need to remain here while we reweigh and reprocess the cargo." "That's insane. That's not how inspections work." The inspector's face remained expressionless. "Those are the regulations. Please remain with your vehicle." Robert tried calling his dispatcher, but his phone had no signal despite showing full bars. He tried the CB radio, static. He walked to the weigh station office to speak with a supervisor, but the building was locked, lights off, despite it being mid-morning on a weekday. He returned to his truck to find another inspector had joined the first. This one looked identical to the first inspector, not similar but identical, as if they were twins wearing the same uniform. They were both inside his trailer now, removing cargo, weighing each box individually, documenting everything with that same mechanical precision. Hours passed. The sun crossed the sky. Robert grew hungry, thirsty, desperate. He tried to leave the inspection bay, but an electronic gate had closed across the exit, blocking his truck. When he attempted to walk out of the facility, alarms sounded, and the inspectors emerged to tell him he couldn't leave while inspection was in progress. By late afternoon, there were 4 inspectors, all identical, all working on his truck. They'd removed every piece of cargo, had disassembled parts of his engine, were measuring and documenting everything with absurd precision. One was counting the threads on individual bolts. Another was measuring the length of wiring harnesses to the millimeter. "How long is this going to take?" Robert demanded. The first inspector looked at him with those flat, emotionless eyes. "Until we've completed our examination. We've found 127 violations so far. Each must be documented properly." 127 violations. That's impossible. I know regulations. My truck is compliant. Your driver's side mirror glass has a manufacturing date that doesn't match the mirror housing. That's a parts compatibility violation. Your fuel filter was replaced 11,247 miles ago. Regulations recommend replacement every 10,000 miles. That's a maintenance violation. Your logbook entries use blue ink. Regulations require black ink specifically. None of this was real. These weren't actual regulations. Robert knew the rules better than almost any driver on the road. But the inspectors continued cataloging imaginary violations, their list growing longer as the day progressed. Night fell. The weigh station's lights came on, harsh fluorescence that turned everything stark and shadowless. There were now 8 inspectors, all identical, all working tirelessly without breaks or conversation. They'd completely disassembled his truck, every component laid out on the pavement in neat rows, labeled and measured. Robert sat on the ground, exhausted and terrified. He'd been at the weigh station for over 15 hours. Other trucks continued to pass through the facility, their drivers giving him curious looks but not stopping. He tried waving them down, screaming for help, but they ignored him or didn't see him. At midnight, one of the inspectors approached him. "We've completed the initial inspection. We found 3,847 violations. Before we can proceed to the secondary inspection, you'll need to correct all violations." Secondary inspection. No, this is insane, I'm leaving. Your vehicle is currently disassembled. You cannot leave until it's reassembled and passes inspection. Robert looked at the components of his truck spread across the inspection bay. Thousands of parts, from engine blocks to tiny screws, all separated and organized. It would take days, maybe weeks, to reassemble everything. And he didn't have the tools or expertise to do it. "Help me rebuild it then," Robert said. "You took it apart. Help me put it back together." "That's not our function. We inspect, we don't repair." The inspectors walked away, returning to their clipboard documentation, leaving Robert alone with his disassembled truck. He sat there for hours, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't a normal inspection. This was something else, some kind of trap or nightmare masquerading as official procedure. As dawn approached, Robert noticed something that made his blood run cold. The inspection bay's walls were covered in photos, documents he hadn't seen before. As he walked closer, he saw they were pictures of other trucks, other drivers, all in various states of disassembly. Some photos were decades old, judging by the vehicles, but others looked recent. One photo showed a driver sitting exactly where Robert had been sitting, surrounded by truck parts, looking exhausted and defeated. The photo was dated 15 years ago. Robert recognized the driver's face from missing person reports he'd seen on trucker forums. The man had disappeared on I-15 in Utah, last seen entering a weigh station. Robert made a decision. He couldn't reassemble his truck, couldn't pass an inspection based on imaginary regulations that would keep expanding forever. He needed to escape. He looked at the electronic gate blocking the exit. The inspectors were on the far side of the facility, focused on their documentation. Robert ran. He hit the gate at full speed, his shoulder slamming into the metal barrier. It hurt, but the gate had some give. He hit it again and again, desperation giving him strength. On the fourth impact, something broke, electronics sparking, and the gate swung open. Robert ran out of the inspection bay, out of the facility, onto the shoulder of the highway. Behind him, he heard alarms, heard that mechanical voice calling for him to return. He didn't look back. He ran up the highway shoulder, waving desperately at passing trucks. A truck pulled over, the driver leaning out. "You okay, man? Please, I need a ride, anywhere away from here." The driver looked confused but nodded. "Climb in." As they pulled away, Robert looked back at the weigh station. It looked normal, just a standard DOT facility. No signs of the inspection bays full of disassembled trucks. No identical inspectors, just a routine weigh station in daylight. "What happened back there?" the driver asked. "Got pulled in for inspection. They wouldn't let me leave." "Inspection? That station has been closed for 6 months. Structural issues with the building. They've got signs posted, all commercial vehicles bypass it." Robert felt reality tilt. He'd been at a closed weigh station, inspected by people who shouldn't exist, for a night that might not have happened. When he checked his phone, it showed 9 a.m. on February 9th. He'd entered the weigh station at 8 a.m. Only 1 hour had passed, but he'd experienced an entire night. He never returned for his truck. Reported it stolen, collected the insurance, bought a new rig. But he's driven past that weigh station since, always in daylight, always with other traffic around. It looks abandoned, building falling apart, scales rusted. But sometimes, if he looks carefully, he can see trucks in the inspection bays, drivers standing beside disassembled vehicles, and identical inspectors with clipboards, cataloging violations that will never be corrected, conducting inspections that will never end. Robert warns other drivers now, posts on forums about weigh stations that seem wrong, about inspections that go too long, about rules that don't match regulations. Most dismiss him as paranoid, but some drivers respond with their own stories, similar experiences at different locations, inspection stations that exist to trap rather than regulate, that feed on the time and sanity of drivers who have the misfortune to be directed inside. And late at night, Robert sometimes dreams he's back in that inspection bay, watching as identical inspectors disassemble his life piece by piece, documenting violations in reality itself, finding flaws in existence that can never be corrected, conducting an inspection that measures not just a truck's compliance but a human's worthiness, and always finding the inspected lacking, ensuring the process never ends, ensuring that somewhere, in inspection bays that exist sideways to normal DOT facilities, drivers remain trapped forever, waiting for clearance to leave that will never be granted. Story 10. The wrong delivery address. Sharon Mitchell had been delivering for the same grocery distribution company for 16 years, running a regular route that covered rural communities in Montana and Wyoming. She knew her delivery addresses by heart, had relationships with the receivers at every stop, could navigate the route with her eyes closed. That familiarity made it impossible when she delivered to a version of a store that didn't exist anymore, to people who were supposed to be dead. The date was May 22, 2021. Sharon's route included 13 stops from Billings, Montana, down through Wyoming to Cheyenne, then back north. Her 8th stop was a small grocery store in a town called Riverside, Wyoming, population 842. She'd been delivering there for all 16 years of her career. The store was called Morrison's Market, owned by a family that had run it for 3 generations. Sharon arrived at the store at 3:30 p.m. exactly on schedule. She pulled into the loading dock, backed up to the bay, and opened her trailer. This was routine, something she'd done hundreds of times at this exact location. The loading dock door opened and Frank Morrison came out, the store owner, a man in his 60s who Sharon had known for years. "Afternoon, Sharon. Right on time as always." "Hi Frank, got your order, should be everything on the manifest." They went through the familiar routine of unloading. Sharon's helper, a young guy named Carlos who'd been working with her for 6 months, helped move boxes from the trailer into the store's backroom. Frank checked items off his list, everything proceeding normally, except something felt wrong. Sharon couldn't identify what, just a nagging sense that details were off. The store looked slightly different. The paint color wasn't quite right. The layout of the backroom was altered. When she glanced through the door into the main store, she saw customers shopping, but their clothes looked dated, styles from years ago. "Frank, did you remodel recently?" she asked. He looked confused. "Remodel? No, why would we? Everything's the same as it's always been." Sharon shook off the feeling. She was tired, had been on the road for 8 hours already. Details could look different when you were exhausted. They finished the unloading, Frank signed the delivery confirmation, and Sharon prepared to leave. As she climbed into her truck, Carlos said, "Did that seem weird to you?" "What do you mean?" "That guy, Frank, I could swear I've seen his picture somewhere, like in a news article or something." Sharon started the engine and pulled away from the store. In her rearview mirror, she watched Frank wave from the loading dock, the same friendly gesture he'd made hundreds of times before. But Carlos's comment bothered her. She pulled out her phone and searched for Frank Morrison, Riverside, Wyoming. The results made her pull over. The top result was an obituary. Frank Morrison, owner of Morrison's Market, had died 3 years ago on April 15, 2018. Heart attack, age 64. The store had closed permanently after his death, his children choosing not to continue the business. "That's impossible," Sharon said. "I just delivered to him. He's alive." Carlos was searching on his own phone. "Sharon, look at this." He showed her a news article from 2018. "Store closes after owner's death. Morrison's Market, a fixture in Riverside for 47 years, shut its doors permanently." Sharon felt her hands shaking. She pulled up the company's route schedule on her tablet, checked the delivery address for Stop 8. Morrison's Market, Riverside, Wyoming. Active customer, regular deliveries scheduled every 2 weeks. According to her company's system, she'd been delivering there continuously, including deliveries after April 2018 after Frank's death. She looked back at the store. From where she'd pulled over about a quarter mile away, she could see it clearly. Morrison's Market looking exactly as it should, customers' cars in the parking lot, the neon open sign glowing in the window. "We need to go back," Carlos said. "We need to figure out what's happening." Sharon drove back to the store, her heart racing. But when she pulled into the parking lot, everything had changed. The store was dark, clearly abandoned. The neon sign was broken, weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot, windows were boarded up. There were no customers, no cars, no sign anyone had been there in years. Sharon and Carlos got out, walked to the loading dock. The door she'd backed up to 15 minutes ago was chained shut, rust on the metal suggesting it hadn't been opened in a long time. She tried the chains. They didn't budge, looked like they'd been there for years. "We were just here," Carlos said, his voice shaking. "We unloaded dozens of boxes. We talked to Frank. This was an operating store 15 minutes ago." Sharon walked around to the front of the building. Through gaps in the boarded windows, she could see the interior. Empty shelves, debris on the floor, clear signs of long abandonment. She tried the front door. Locked, more chains, a notice from the county saying the property was condemned. She took photos of everything, documentation that the store was abandoned. Then she checked her delivery tablet. Stop 8 showed as completed, signature captured, delivery confirmed at 3:47 p.m. She pulled up the signature. It was there, Frank Morrison's distinctive scrawl, the same signature she'd seen hundreds of times. Sharon called her dispatcher, trying to explain what had happened. The dispatcher was confused, told her that Morrison's Market was definitely an active customer. They'd been receiving deliveries regularly. When Sharon insisted the store was abandoned, the dispatcher pulled up his records and said, "Sharon, you've made deliveries there 37 times in the last 3 years. Since 2018, every delivery confirmed and signed for." "The owner died in 2018, Sharon said. "That's not possible. We have signatures. We have confirmation. The account pays its bills on time. Someone's been receiving those deliveries." Sharon ended the call. She stood in the parking lot of the abandoned store, looking at her tablet showing a confirmed delivery to a place that was clearly closed. Carlos was pale, quiet, processing what was happening. "I want to check something," Sharon said. She pulled up her route history, looked at photos she'd taken at previous deliveries. She found pictures from Morrison's Market, dozens of them, photos she'd snapped casually over the years. She scrolled through them, looking at dates. There were photos from 2019, showing the store looking clean and operational. Photos from 2020, same thing. Photos from earlier in 2021, all showing an active operating business. But according to the obituary and news articles, the store had been closed since April 2018. Carlos made a discovery of his own. "Sharon, look at this." He was showing her a social media memorial page for Frank Morrison. The page had posts from his children, from community members, all dated April 2018, all mourning his death. But there were photos, recent photos, pictures posted to the memorial page showing Frank at the store, serving customers, going through his daily routine. Photos dated 2019, 2020, 2021, years after he'd supposedly died. Someone had been updating his memorial page with new photos of him alive and working. But the comments on the photos were strange. People weren't questioning how he could be alive. They were writing things like "still watching over his store," and "some people never really leave," and "death can't stop a man who loved his work." Sharon drove away from Riverside in a daze. She completed the rest of her route mechanically, barely aware of what she was doing. When she returned to the distribution center the next day, she went to her supervisor and said she wanted to drop Stop 8 from her route. "Morrison's Market. Why, they're one of our best accounts. Never late on payments, never any issues. Please, just assign it to someone else." The supervisor agreed, puzzled but accommodating. Another driver named Tom Patterson took over that stop. Sharon ran into him a week later and asked how the delivery went. "Fine," Tom said. "Nice old guy, Frank, friendly, helped with the unloading. Why? Did you notice anything strange?" "Like what?" Sharon described what she'd experienced, the obituary, the abandoned store. Tom looked at her like she was crazy. I was just there yesterday, stores operating normally. Frank's alive and well. Maybe you found information about a different Frank Morrison. But Sharon knew she hadn't. She delivered to that store for 16 years. She knew Frank, knew his store, knew for certain he was the same person in the obituary. Yet somehow he was still there, still running his market, still receiving deliveries, existing in a state that violated the boundary between life and death. She started researching, found more cases. Businesses that continued operating years after closing. Store owners who died but continued working. Delivery drivers who made stops at places that should no longer exist. The pattern was always similar. Small businesses in remote areas, stores that had been family-owned for decades, operated by people who loved their work so completely that even death couldn't make them leave. Sharon requested a transfer to a different route. She couldn't handle delivering to Morrison's market anymore, couldn't face the impossibility of it. But she still drives through Riverside sometimes, takes the long way around to avoid passing the store. Because on several occasions, when she's been forced to drive past it, she's seen both versions simultaneously. The abandoned, condemned building, and overlaid on it like a double-exposure photograph. The operating market with customers coming and going, with Frank visible through the windows, arranging displays and running the register, living and working in a version of reality that never accepted his death. And she knows now that some people's dedication to their work, their connection to place and routine, is so strong that it persists beyond life. Some stores never really close, some owners never really retire, and some delivery routes include stops that exist in the spaces between what is and what should no longer be, serving communities that exist partially in memory and partially in that thin margin where the living and the dead share the same space, the same routine, the same eternal day of commerce and connection. Late at night, Sharon still gets email confirmations for deliveries to Morrison's market. She's not on that route anymore, hasn't been for over a year, but the system sends her notifications anyway. Delivery completed, signature captured, Frank Morrison, Morrison's Market, Riverside, Wyoming. And attached to each notification is a photo, automatically captured by the delivering driver's device, showing the store interior, the back room, and sometimes, reflected in a window or visible in the background, Frank Morrison himself, forever in his 60s, forever running his store, forever accepting deliveries in a place that closed 3 years ago, but somehow never stopped existing for those who deliver to the thin places, where death is just another detail to be ignored in the eternal routine of commerce and connection.